Welcome everyone. My name is Carol Hernandez. I am the Senior Instructional Designer at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching at Stony Brook University. Welcome to this panel discussion on inclusive teaching. Today we will be talking about linguistic justice. I just wanted to introduce my co-facilitators and also welcome to our American Sign Language interpreters, Lou Ann Walker and Nora Reed. Also, just a reminder, we're currently in National Hispanic Heritage Month, which goes from September 15 to October 15. And just wanted to give a shout out to Kimberly Kennedy, our Stony Brook librarian, who created a LibGuide for today's event. And we will be recording this event and we will be sending the link out to whoever registered. So I just wanted to quickly go through our explanation of why we do this in CELT, and then I'll hand it over to my co-facilitators to introduce themselves. So the reason that we do this is because we focus on teaching and learning, and we focus on excellent teaching and learning, and we believe that excellent teaching and learning is inclusive of not only all learners, but also all instructors. So because we do have sign language interpreters with us today, we ask that you please, if you could remember to say your name before you start speaking, make sure that your name is visible in your Zoom screen, that we only speak one person at a time. And participants, you can go ahead and turn off your camera and use the chat to post questions. So I am going to hand it over to my co-facilitators right now.
Hello, my name's Jenna Kim. I am also a facilitator for today's panel discussion. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to briefly let our other co-facilitator, Jenny, introduce herself, and then I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Jenny Zhang. I'm an instructional designer at CELT. I'm also today's co-facilitator. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Laura Lisabeth.
Hi, everybody. I am a full-time lecturer in the program in Writing and Rhetoric. I teach a range of writing classes. Linguistic justice is the focus of my own research, so I feel, very, very passionate about this topic. So I hope everyone enjoys today's talk.
Thank you. And Dr. Sharma.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sharma. I am an associate professor and graduate program director in the program in Writing and Rhetoric here at Stony Brook. I am a faculty affiliated to the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication. And language justice is a mission that I feel like I have always cared deeply about in my personal, professional, and social lives. I've written about this issue in many op-eds and some articles, and participated and contributed to in a number of initiatives there at the MIC and Stony Brook University.
Thank you. And Dr. Loredana Polezzi.
Hi, so I'm Loredana Polezzi. I'm also at Stony Brook, where I teach in the Department of Languages and Cultural Studies. I have a background in Italian studies. I am myself originally Italian and have traveled to various places in the world, and I consider myself a multilingual. My interests are in multilingualism and migration and in translation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Agnes He.
Hello, I'm Agnes He. I'm an applied linguist. I'm teaching in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies at Stony Brook University. I have the great honor and privilege to direct the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication at the university also. Great to be part of the panel today.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to briefly outline how this panel discussion is going to look like today. We have three main parts of our panel discussion. First part, just jumping into the topic of linguistic justice and defining it, led by Dr. Loredana and Agnes. And then in the second part, we have Dr. Laura and Shyam kind of jumping more into the teaching practices and how linguistic justice looks like in the classroom. And then the last part, we will have Dr. Agnes and Shyam talking a little bit more about how we can move forward with this concept. After each part, we're quickly going to go over some of the questions we got from the registration form. We may not get to address all of them, but we'll try our best to address as many as we can. So we'll just jump right in and talk a little bit more about linguistic justice altogether. Loredana, can you tell us a little bit more about what linguistic justice means to you?
Okay, so I would start by saying that linguistic justice starts with paying attention to language. And on the other hand, every time we do not pay attention to language, even when language is not the focus of what we're doing, but if we don't pay attention to it, that's where we are at risk of perpetrating or continuing linguistic injustice. So for me, this is about not assuming that language is transparent, not assuming that everyone will simply share our language and our linguistic assumptions and our linguistic habits, and paying attention, on the other hand, of the difference that is around us. And then when we pay attention to that, that may become, and we should think of it, not as a problem, but as an asset, as a form of richness that is around us. Now, every time we open our mouth, I'm sure you're doing this with me now, it happened to me at the supermarket this morning, my accent says something about me, says something about my history beyond language. And whether we're paying attention or not, especially if we're not paying attention, we're likely to make assumptions about the person we're talking to, we're listening to, on the basis of the language that they're using. That may be a foreign accent we hear in their voice. It may be a different variant of the same language that we are ourselves identifying with. So in that way, without even realizing it, we may be complicit with mechanisms of exclusion. We may be making certain voices, certain variants of languages, certain cultures more or less visible or audible. It's wonderful to have sign language interpreters here today, because that makes it visible instantly. We see what it means to exclude someone or to include someone in our conversations. So for me, the question is always one of attention, of awareness, of sensitization, of paying attention to language. I'm sure I want to tell you a story later about how this applies not just to specialists in languages, but for instance, to doctors, to people in STEM subjects. I'll leave that for later. For now, I want to finish this brief introduction by asking you all a question, and that is, ask yourselves, when you step into your classroom, whatever that classroom might be, how aware are you of the linguistic diversity of the people in that class? And that is the first question I want to pose to all of us. And over to Agnes.
All right. So to me, linguistic justice is about reducing linguistic injustice. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit of what Loredana has just said about injustice. So when you think about language, we think about language diversity, because language is an incredibly diverse phenomenon. There are literally thousands of different languages and dialects and registers and so on. And the various kinds of linguistic bits and pieces that each of us have available as our communicative tools, these are the things that we call linguistic repertoire. And this kind of repertoire, our repertoire, is shaped by, as Loredana said, by circumstances of our childhood, our upbringing, our education, our life trajectory. And so our repertoire comes to stand for who we are. Now, to say that languages are diverse is not enough. We have to also understand that diversity also always implies linguistic hierarchy, and that is where the problem is, right? So, because language is not something that you have or I have independent of each other. Language is something that is fundamentally relational and interactional. So the meaning of language that we construe comes out of interactions that we're engaged with one another. So it is in interaction, and I emphasize, it is in interaction that we translate linguistic diversity into linguistic hierarchies, right? So in that sense, then the repertoires are not just seen as product of time and space and experience, but we often see these repertoires as either superior or inferior, as good or bad, or even right or wrong, appropriate or inappropriate, both at very small scales, such as, communications between friends and the family, or at very large scales when we talk about, what ought to be the standard language, the national language. And then let's think about English, as a global language today. So this kind of a social interpretation of diversity as hierarchies then leads to a wide range of social injustices, right? So we then think that some people are more worth listening to, some people are less worth listening to, some people sound to us more credible or less credible, more sincere, less sincere, more important, less important, or some people sound more likable, or some people would sound less likable, based not on what they say, the quality of what they say, but based on how they say it, right? So in other words, this kind of injustice dismisses the language of people, the languages of or certain groups of people, and by analogy, then we're dismissing those groups of people themselves, and that is harmful. Why is it harmful? Because that's not fair, right? This is not fair. Some people, simply by virtue of the way they speak in a certain way, they are made to feel inferior or ashamed, and they feel marginalized, right? And this kind of injustice also leads to further harm, because much of the social goods, right? We're talking about education, work, healthcare, and so on and so forth. All of these social goods are mediated through language, right? So in other words, if we have a mismatch between the language or the main language of an institution and the very people that institution is supposed to serve, if there's a mismatch between these two, then we would have created a barrier to the services and goods that's provided by that institution, right? So to be more concrete, in the context of higher education, we have a very diverse group of students at different kinds of students' needs and requests, and then do we respond to these requests and needs differently, right? Do we provide the same kinds of interaction opportunities for students who speak differently? Are we giving the kind of assessments, grading standards that are fair and equitable to students who bring in different kinds of language varieties, and so on and so forth. And I know that would be elaborated by my colleagues in the second part of this event today. So again, to sum up, to me, linguistic justice is to reduce all of the above injustice. Thank you.
Can I just add one final thing to what Agnes was saying? Because when we think of linguistic injustice, I think it is also important to think about how language functions in relations to other areas of social justice or injustice. And so one important thing to remember is that sometimes precisely because language is that instrumental role of allowing us to exchange communication in society, we think of it purely in instrumental ways. And that makes us forget that language can also sometimes, precisely because of those assumptions that both myself and Agnes have been talking about, can then function almost as a proxy of other categories, whether that is ethnicity, the color of our skin, whether it is gender, whether it is class. All of those things can be heard in our voices. And often when we do not pay attention to linguistic justice and injustice, those other categories are also deeply implicated.
Can I quickly add a few concrete examples I was thinking of this morning? So to give concrete examples to what Agnes and Loredana just highlighted powerfully, I'm thinking of language justice as in the family, a grandmother's need to talk to her grandchildren. In the community, the right of a tribal community to get an education in their own language and to access and exchange and apply their community's knowledge through their language. In learning, the comfort of an international student or a student with a Kentucky accent in New York to continue speaking to his friend in the elevator without feeling embarrassed or laughed at. In teaching, the responsibility of a student teacher, the student's physics teacher or economics teacher, for example, to not dock grades for grammar mistakes, because that's not the learning objective. And in society in general, the dignity of speakers of non-dominant languages and language varieties for not being regarded as less intelligent or undeserving of anything due to language difference, the way that Agnes powerfully described earlier, all the social goods and opportunities and privileges because we speak different languages. It is an idea of advancing human community and common good by building on rather than bringing down the different languages that we speak.
Thank you for adding that, Sam. I just wanted to bring us back a little bit and reorient ourselves. I like how we got some concrete examples of what linguistic justice might look like, and what are some underlying issues behind the concept of linguistic justice. So my next question will be then, given our socio-political and global climate, why is it important for us to now discuss linguistic justice?
That's the law, right?
So I'm thinking, I especially coming in on the coattails of what Sam was saying so well, is that every student needs to feel empowered to bring their cultural history and their knowledge making potential of all their languages into their education. Those are resources for education. I don't think we always, or we have historically, my research is mainly on the historicization of this idea of standardized English, but we haven't always, seen standardized English as something that needs to be challenged. There's also a lot of thinking right now coming from, there's a scholar named Jerry Wan Lee who's talking in these really imaginative ways about reconceptualizing language as Englishes, multiple kinds of English. And he talks about it in aspirational terms because it's so clear when you're in a writing classroom. I can speak from that sort of ground level of teaching early undergraduates, academic discourse. And that is a place where we're working with this elephant in the room, which is the objectives and the standards that an institution makes us operate within. And I think the idea of multiple Englishes is such a rich thought, but it hits that ceiling where you have to then assess a student. And usually the outside standard is that, or the outside objective or learning goals that your institution or your program might have don't allow you to, honor those other Englishes. Students still have to jump through that hoop. So I do think that that we have this sort. I think of it as an elephant in the room, because assessment always seems to get into the way of how we can actually operate with students in equitable ways, in just ways, in terms of their language practices. So that's something that I know that some of my colleagues will speak to with much more experience, is the institutional side of the issue.
Sorry. Just to build on the elephant in the room, the medium of instruction that Laura mentioned, I'm also a writing teacher, but I also want to address the very diverse audience today. I was looking at the registration metadata, so to speak, and there are instructional designers, university administrators, colleagues from professional fields of all kinds within and beyond the university. And so for all of us, the idea of language justice, as we were discussing earlier, are relevant. Let me begin with the relevance in teaching. It is through language that we teach and learn. Language mediates and shapes. And as a student of rhetoric, I would also say that language not only embodies and transfers meaning as a vehicle, but actually enacts meaning in the process. And in that process, because of all of the reasons that Agnes and Loredana and Laura pointed out, because of all of those reasons, the power dynamic comes into play. Inequality and injustice comes into play. Discrimination and prejudice comes into play. And discrimination and prejudice and bias and bigotry does not happen among terrible people out there. It happens among the most kind, nice, caring, loving professor who punishes the student for something that is not even relevant to the course objective. Think of a physics professor or a librarian or a university administrator who has a different attitude to someone who speaks a Kentucky accent. I studied in Kentucky. That is where the relevance of language justice comes in. If you think about our identities, our cultures, our epistemology, our society, our knowledge bases, right? Then they're all carried, mediated, shaped by language. And to misjudge or to be prejudiced about language is to really affect all of those dynamics. People's identity, people's dignity, people's sense of belonging, to undermine all of those. Once you undermine a student's sense of belonging in the class, you really cannot use any pedagogy that will be effective. As Carol said in the very beginning, that good teaching is inclusive teaching, period. In my teaching as a writing instructor, language is not only an elephant in the room, as Laura was saying, it's a room itself. We are in it. I am shocked that most of us simply assume that English is the default language of learning writing skills. So when you say writing, you think English. What about the student who has to write in all of the other languages to their grannies, to their communities, to discover knowledge from their tribal communities, to exchange and share knowledge across language borders? And it is as if we use other languages in other parts of our life, but when it comes to education, we should reserve it for the dominant one. But how are we going to conduct our family and life and community life? How are we going to tell our grandmas what we are doing research on? Do they not deserve to know what we're doing? We have suppressed people's ability to access and use their knowledge, to share and exchange their knowledge, to apply new knowledge gained from higher education in their lives and their communities. We are progressive and kind and mindful and all, but we are involved in the suppression of languages and the suppression of vast epistemologies. Of course, we can say, let us all assimilate into one language. Becoming educated is becoming an English-only person. But it is not easy as that. Let us say that we can all assimilate into one human community with just one language. Well, it'll take generations of destruction and disaster in the wake. Generations of grandmothers who won't understand their grandchildren. Generations of people who devalue and deny the basis of their cultural knowledge, their community, their connections, their family. And for that reason, we cannot continue the current regime of assimilation into one language. In China, it's the Chinese only, not the other many dozen languages. In Nepal, Nepalese only, where I come from, not the 124 other languages. What is the harm with all of the languages being involved in all of our life, in learning and teaching and talking and making meaning and exchanging meaning? The fear that if we speak different languages, it'll be too costly. We'll be confused. We will affect, the learning of one language because we are learning. No, human brain is multilingual. We've always been multilingual, anthropologically multilingual, biologically multilingual, naturally multilingual. People have married across cultures. So I won't go into that, but it is extremely important to understand that the mission of education is a mission of being able to speak to different people. The mission of education is being able to speak different versions of yourself, to be yourself. And that is why multilingualism, language justice, translanguaging are not only relevant, but important, unavoidable, inevitable in teaching and learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. That actually brings up a good point for us to think about how we can actually put this into practice then, knowing the importance of what linguistic justice is and how much it means right now in our current society. Then how do we make that actually happen in our higher education classrooms? So if all of our panelists can give us some examples of how does linguistic justice come up in your own teaching, whether it's in curriculum design, classroom discourse, interaction, or assessment, how do you actually make it come up in your class?
So I'll start off because what I want to share is something that's kind of an umbrella in which is sort of a disposition to set in the classroom in the beginning. I try to historicize English for students. For example, I often give out, there's a wonderful anthology, which I would love to share with everybody. It's called Rotten English. And it's edited by Dora Ahmad, who is from St. John's University. She's a local New York person. And it's a collection of vernacular literature, which is really wonderful. But toward the end of the book, and this is very particularly rhetorical where it's placed, Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education is near the end of the anthology. So I always assign that little piece of Macaulay's Minute where he discusses the fact that English language is millions of times superior to Sanskrit and Arabic in 1837 as he addresses Parliament. And then I pair it with a vernacular piece of literature. For example, Patricia Wetu, who's a Maori writer, a story called Letters from Wetu about a Maori student in a British colonial school, and how bored and uncomfortable she is. And she spends every period writing letters to friends rather than performing the language or the mathematical, skills that she's supposed to be doing. But I think it is very valuable, particularly to a room full of international students who are, translingual and are probably, this may be the first time they've ever talked about the colonial impact of English on their lives or their places of birth. So I think that's one of the great first steps that you can take in a classroom that I think it could work in many disciplines. Just the impact to have students recognize that initial colonial impact on local languages and how and to talk about it in terms of today, and that students sitting in the British colonial classroom. So I just
So
share that.
Shall I go next with just a few quick ideas? So first of all, I just wanted to say that what Sam said about, children, grandchildren, and grandmothers, that has literally happened to me. I have had people in various countries saying to me in one and the same breath, almost, I want my children to speak the global language. And it is such a pity my children can no longer speak to their grandparents. And I think we have a social responsibility to not creating situations such as those. But in terms of examples, I teach in areas in the modern languages area, and I also teach in humanities in general. So for me, one thing, for instance, is a radical rethinking of what we understand by error. And it's moving away from thinking of, for instance, academic English, rhetoric, and so on as a condition of normativity. This is what we want, to professionalizing. So I no longer mark my students' work in terms of errors. I say, I'm doing the editor's job here. I do what I would do if I were editing your work for a journal, for a blog online or something like that. So that it's not about me providing the exactness, the correct version. It's more about a professional skill that I'm passing on. In languages, there is an assumption about perfection, and again, that requires a radical rethinking. We have assumed in teaching languages and teaching modern languages, we've assumed this model of the native speaker, which is the equivalent of what in linguistics is known as the ideal speaker. It's a figment of our imagination. By setting that model up for our students, we're setting them up to fail, basically, because once you're a non-native speaker, you're forever a non-native speaker if that's what you're assuming, perfection. But what we want, if we start thinking not in terms of lack of failure, but in terms of wealth, what we're giving students, and that is true for students of languages, but it's also true for those multilingual students in any other classroom, we are helping to educate people who can then go and talk to multiple groups, to multiple constituencies, because of the richness of their linguistic and cultural skills. So it makes no sense for me to ask them to leave all that knowledge and all those skills at the door as they come into our classroom. So another way is to raise their awareness. So raise our own awareness and then raise their awareness. I started by asking people to write, linguistic biographies, as we do in languages, often in applied linguistics. Now I get them to draw it. So it gets away from that language and the meta language. I ask them to draw their language map and their position, their relationship with languages. And so much comes up about affect, about anxieties, but also about the love that they have with an evolving landscape of languages. So that's another tip for me. Get them to think, get your own students to think about their own relationship with languages in a dynamic way.
Thank you. Those are great examples of how it might look like in classroom. After Agnes gives us another example, I'm going to ask Sam if you can share some examples of how it might look like in STEM classes as well.
Thank you, Gina. So my background has something to do with the discourse and communication and second language acquisition. So I'll be speaking from my own particular linguistic area. So this is what happens. Every time we have a so-called native speaker of a language in communication with what we call a non-native speaker of a language, whether it is in English or some other languages in the world. And then when we have problems in communication, let's say, nobody can figure out what is happening, the tendency is that we tend to assign blame to the non-native speaker, right? Every time there's a problem, that's the non-native speaker's fault. So I would like, my suggestion would be that we all need to, if we all learn to listen better, then we would be promoting linguistic justice just a small act like this, listen better, and to understand that communication is a two-way traffic, and the burden and the joy the burden as well as the joy of communication ought to be shared by all the participants in any kind of interactional engagement, right? So it really makes sense. If you think someone from Boston versus someone who's from the Deep South, when they get together, they would have to do a lot of what we call speech accommodation, right? So speech accommodation is something that we naturally do. And so why is it that we suspend that natural activity of speech accommodation when we are in communication with a non-native speaker or a speaker of a variety with which we're not familiar, right? That does not make sense. So I think in the classrooms, first of all, I think we should all learn to listen better. Now, how do we listen better? There's a whole body of work that is called conversation analysis that looks at how we listen and how we take turns and how we allocate speaking opportunities and how we provide each other with interactional opportunities in terms of, how much of a gap do we allow for in between speaking turns, right? Who has the right to nominate a topic, to ask a question, who has the interactional space to elaborate on an answer, or who has this opportunity and the privilege to be the selected next speaker in addressing and answering a question, and so on and so forth. And these kinds of things, that is something that we call classroom interaction or classroom discourse. And teachers have a lot of power in terms of allocating these kinds of interactional resources for our students. And we ought to be paying a lot of attention to the students who speak a little differently, who perhaps are speaking a little haltingly in English as their additional language, right? We should also be thinking about how can we maximize the opportunities for their verbal participation. If some students who are less proficient speakers or who are emerging speakers in the English language, could they be given more opportunities to progress from small group participation to larger classroom presentations, for example, right? So in the larger context of a classroom interaction, the educational literature tells us the overwhelming pattern that we find is this IRE, the initiation, the teacher initiation, the student response, and then the evaluation move. And this is a pattern we still find in lots of classrooms, regardless of the content that we're teaching and learning. So this IRE, this three-step classroom discursive mode, can each of the steps be more broadly distributed, right, among students? And we have a lot of, as instructors, I think there's a lot that we can do to make sure that we plan the IRE in such a way that would maximize, that would include everybody, that would enhance the opportunities for everybody to be a part of this classroom discourse process. Thank you.
Jenna, to address the issue of how would this apply in the STEM field far out of the language and linguistic and writing and humanities that we're talking about. I did my doctoral dissertation in engineering, how engineers communicate conceptualized language and language rhetoricity, and what implications that has for teaching, learning, and knowledge making. So I would like to start by addressing the idea that scientists are a pure, world of universal objective ideas, that their ideas, their teaching and learning does not have to grapple with this, the vagaries of the world of language and humanities and thoughts and subjectivity. Well, that would be true if the scientists could simply go to the lab, not turn to any human beings, shut their mouth, and just, produce knowledge and make an impact in the world without language involved. That's not the case. all of the things that Agnes and Loredana and Laura said about good teaching, that Carol indicated in the beginning about inclusive teaching, apply. The students should feel they belong there. They should be able to communicate. They should be able to flesh out their ideas, share their ideas, learn. So yes, the fundamentals are the same across the disciplines insofar as power dynamics, student-to-student conversation, teacher-to-student mentorship, all of these occur. Now about the science. Science is actually more transnationally, globally connected, interconnected, borderless phenomenon. You could say that humanities people can be located in one particular culture and burrow down into their history and their discipline. Scientists are by nature, you could say, always already connecting, collaborating, crossing, transcending borders. You see engineers, you see publication, you see for the most collaborative publication across global, the national and cultural border happens among engineers and scientists. So they are already always connected to different communities and different countries and cultures. So we have no excuse as scientists to say that science is universal. It is, but the application is not universal. The dynamics are not universal. The questions we ask, the research that we choose to do and not to do, the epistemology that we are advancing and the epistemology that we're ignoring, the bodies of knowledge among different communities and cultures and tribal histories of knowledge, these are not universal. They are all, and so it is dangerous to assume that science is so pure and out there. If we do that, we will be causing more harm and damage to our monolingual, unjust linguistic injustice within academia. Science will become a more unjust and unfair space within academia that is already unjust and unfair linguistically, right? And what do? Scientists can also say, use all of your languages in order to read, write, communicate, share, exchange, apply knowledge, because science must be put to social good. Scientists would also say, don't hesitate to be who you are, to pursue your interest in science and your application of science to do good in society. You can put a statement in the syllabus. I can share that in the chat box. A statement that says, this is a space for everyone. I want you to utilize all of your languages, all of your epistemologies, and be yourself. And then activities could also be multilingual, multicultural, and their application and their implications. Within science and engineering, you can choose projects that advance social justice, that engage linguistic justice. You write, you code, you present, you share, you do all of these things through language. And as I said, unless you go into a vacuum where science happens without human language, identity, culture, then all of the things that we have said so far apply. In some cases, even more.
Thank you. One more question that I want to ask before we move forward into our last segment of this discussion is how do we make assessment in your classrooms more linguistically just then? We've got a lot of questions from our registrants as well about, do we develop different rubrics for our students who don't speak English as their first language? Do we give them different assignments? How do we assess them? To what level do we assess them? We had a range of different questions there. And so we would like to know how we can practice linguistic justice a little bit more in our assessment in the classroom.
I can add into the conversation just the knowledge that I can share that I never grade a student on grammar. That just never enters into the picture at all. You know, they revise, they get a lot of formative feedback. You know, but this again, it's getting into that area where you bump up against assessment problems. You know, a student may not pass the basic freshman writing class that Sam and I both teach if they have too many sentence level errors because they're multilingual students. So it involves a lot of one-on-one revision to kind of get over that, what I feel is like is a real social justice hurdle, so it really comes down to labor between the student and the instructor.
I could follow on from that. I think for me, again, something that Laura said, but this is not about creating different assignments. It's about thinking from the beginning about how to design inclusive assignments, which is a different thing. And that means, again, not assuming a normativity, but thinking about what it is. Sam says this beautifully and says it all the time. What is it that we really want to assess? That doesn't mean that we cannot also help students to gain skills that may be important for them in socialization at other levels professionally. As I was saying, I make a difference, and I make that difference, I want to repeat it, in my language classes as much as I make it in any other classes I teach. I make a difference between the kind of surface errors where I can say to, or even the, the register level and the organization of a text, and I'm saying, look, I'm helping you as an editor. I am a professional editor. I'm helping you to understand what would happen if you, as a, in brackets, native speaker or not, whatever it might be, you were to use your writing skills professionally, you would be dealing with editors at all these levels. So this is what I'm doing. I'm not imposing my norm as a native speaker who always knows best. So it's opening that up. It's also putting ourselves on the line sometimes and saying, I don't necessarily have the answer. We can share that answer. So one of the things that and I owe that to some amazing colleagues at one of my previous universities. One of the things I've been doing for years now is to try and create a safe space in some of the classes where we can actually share and not mark, but improve some of the writing pieces together. So we're working collectively as readers. Because again, for any writer, whether native or not, one of the difficult things is to imagine that reader out there and communicate with them. So that for me is the point, designing inclusive assignments from the beginning and then empowering the learners themselves to say, I was really happy with that, but I'm still not sure with this other thing. How can I improve it? So it's working on that level. And I think that normativity, it's so important, for instance, that language teachers understand that we are not the spokespeople for the language, for the nation or whatever, that vision, as Sam was saying, one nation, one language and culture, completely false. The majority of people in the world are multilingual. I'll share in the chat the link to the CELT statement for a multilingual world, which I was part of writing in 2018, and which is so useful when having to also make these points to institutions, for instance. I'll put that there.
Thank you. We are getting down to 7 minutes left for this panel discussion. So I'm going to move on to our final question. We are very much aware that the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication has been doing great work advocating for linguistic justice. And so my question will be then, how does the MIC envision the work for linguistic justice in the future? And if there are any resources that you can recommend us for, that will be great.
I'll take that to begin with, and then other colleagues can follow up. Let me share my screen. Jenna, please allow me to screen share. Co-host, I think. I just shared on the side a link to the MIC resource for language justice in higher education. Colleagues who are working beyond higher education could probably adapt that resource into your context. Let me see if I can screen share. Jenna, can you open that website and screen share so we can just look at it quickly? It is worth the 30 seconds it might take us for us to look at it. It's a resource that we built together at the MIC. Loredana and I led that initiative. And it's a resource where we describe what language justice is. There's a little statement there too. some questions. And then as a teacher, what can you do in the classroom? Coming up. Yeah. As a teacher, the second tab, Jenna. As a teacher, what can you do in the right next to the description that is highlighted? Yeah. As a teacher, what can you do in the classroom? If you could scroll that down a little bit to show what we have. And then second, as a scholar, what you can do in your research and scholarship. And then finally, as a Stony Brook University and world citizen, what can you do? And there is an interactive tool that you can try. It's really fun. It is a matter of moving from one direction to the other, from a direction where you are rigid and unfair and cruel to a direction where you are flexible and fair and accommodating and willing to serve students' need to advance all their languages. That's the general idea, the philosophy. And Loredana, share more about the resource and about other initiatives we have.
Yeah, I was just writing, Maria Cecilia said, great resource. I was literally just writing in the chat and saying, please, everyone here, if you end up using that resource, please share with us how you use it, but also how we can improve it. Because again, I think what is important, and it's at the heart of the work that Sam and I, with help with everyone involved in MIC and the center, we're doing, is that it's not meant to be normative. It's not meant to be final. It's not meant to be, this is how you do it. It's very much a resource to share. So we would love to hear back from you and know what works, what doesn't work. And it was so exciting to create, to try and think in all those different spaces and drawing on our experiences. I want to take 1 minute, and only 1 minute, because I said at the beginning I would tell a story, and I want to share that. A few years ago, I was working at the University of Namibia in the very first medical school created in that country. And we did a long workshop with students, medical students, about the importance of multilingualism and being aware of that and working with multiple languages. And at the end of that, a final year medical student said to me, every time I have been doing practice and I have asked for an interpreter to work with me, my exact words were, I need an interpreter because the patient doesn't speak English. This from someone for whom English is not a first language, is not a second language, but is their working language and the language they identify with professionally. And then she said to me, what does that sentence, because the patient doesn't speak English, say about my relationship with my patients? And for me, that clicked. She'd understood what that position of power meant, what her assumptions were. My work at that point is not done, but is half done. So when we raise these questions with our students in STEM, as Sam was saying earlier, in whatever classes we're teaching, we're also empowering them. A friend says, the model always has, you teach the teachers, you train the trainers. We're also empowering our students to go out and continue to work with that same model.
So if I may, just to add to what Sam and Loredana have said, in addition to this wonderful resource page, and again, thank you very much for all the work that went into developing this resource page. And as we have heard, we welcome feedback. This is a dynamic, ongoing document that hopefully it will take a lot of people's collaboration for us to move things forward. Now, in addition to the resource page at MIC, we also have developed a workshop series on language and social justice. I will share with Carol and Gina the webpage afterwards, which hopefully in the end we can share with all the participants today. We received support from various entities at Stony Brook University, including the Dean of College of Arts and Sciences, the Chief Diversity Officer, the Office of Vice President for Research, the Provost Office. So there's a lot of energy, a lot of synergy that's put together to advance the cause that we are committed to, which is to promote social justice by advocating for linguistic justice and by addressing implicit and explicit bias against so-called non-standard varieties of English English as an additional language or other non-English languages. We have a distinguished lecture series, and then most of the talks in the last a few years have been dedicated to linguistic justice issues. And as we speak, we are now training a cohort of student language ambassadors to develop a campus engagement video project that is called Stony Brook Stories of Language and Life. We're expecting to collect 400 stories from the multilingual community on campus, and those stories would then be used to promote social justice by through recognizing and respecting the language needs and language rights of everybody in our community. We are also planning to develop a campus-wide language diversity survey and followed by focus group interviews. So a lot is happening at MIC and through the participation efforts of many faculty affiliates. Our ultimate goal is to understand the challenges and the opportunities of multilingual and multidialectal speakers, and so that to make sure that everybody feels welcome and supported, no matter what accent you have, what language you speak. And we want to see that language diversity is a very important and integral part of diversity that ought to be recognized and respected on campus and in the communities as well. So that's the part of the efforts that we have been making, we are making, and where we want to go from here, just to answer Gina's question.
Thank you so much. We have to respect everyone's time now, but we really appreciate our panelists and everyone who came here. I see Mark has raised his hand, so we can stick around a little bit and address Mark's question or remarks as well in a little bit, but we do want to wrap up as well. Right now on the chat, we have included a link to a feedback survey. If you can fill that out, that will be great. We also have another upcoming panel discussion in October about office hours. And so if you would like to register, that will be great too. We barely discussed everything we really planned to and wanted to, but we were really excited to see all the discussion happening here in the chat as well as in the panel discussion. So we might even consider bringing this back up again in the spring if we have people who wants to talk more about it. But at this point, we will wrap up. Carol, if there's anything else you would like to say?
Yes, I'd like to say that I really appreciated everyone here. I want to say thank you to our director, Rose Tirada Esposito, and to our VP in the Office of the Provost, Elizabeth Newman. Thank you so much to our interpreters today, Luann Walker and Nora Reed. Thank you to our CELT colleagues. Thank you, Gina, Jenny. You've been really amazing co-facilitating this. It's a lot of work, but we enjoy doing this, and we would love to see you all at our next panel. Am I forgetting anything? We are going to be sending you links to everything. Please make sure and give us feedback. And that is it. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Mark,